Hey everybody, it's 10 a.m. Can you hear me? Hey everybody, it's 10 a.m. Can you hear me? All right, well actually I heard myself there, so I guess I know the answer to that question. All right, so let's go ahead and begin. I hope you're all doing well. All right, so today we're talking about the cardiovascular system. All right. And cardiovascular system has two parts, the cardio, which is the heart, and then the vasculature. And I'm going to try and move slow through this. Over the next 2 weeks, we'll cover cardiovascular and then lymphatic system. And um, yeah, so we've got a little extra time on this, and I'll try and move slow. So, cardio is the Greek word for heart. Okay, just as an introduction there. Let's move on. I've got this slide here. I went to Kroger. I took a picture of the soda aisle, and if you look at the 2-liter bottles on the top two rows, I counted about 237 2-liter bottles here. Okay, just for comparison. Keep that in mind. We'll come back to it. So the heart pumps about 7,000 liters of blood through the body each day. 7,000 liters is about 3,500 2 liters. That's 3,500 2 liters pumped through the body every day. We go back. This is only 237. I mean, that's amazing, right? All right, so the heart contracts 2.5 billion times in an average person's lifetime. And it pumps blood through the blood vessels in this order. So we start pumping blood out of the heart into arteries, then arterioles, which are smaller arteries, they have thinner walls, and then into capillaries, which have very thin walls. And in the capillaries, that's where we'll see the diffusion of water and nutrients into the tissues. We'll also pick up wastes and water there as well. Blood then flows into the venules, which are like small, thin veins, and then into the veins, which are, of course, larger. And then the veins ultimately return blood back to the heart. Hi, Marina. Good morning. Thank you. Uh, so, uh, good, good. Um, in general, arteries are going to be bigger. Um, no. I'm sorry. Let me back up a second. In general, arteries will be smaller than veins, but they'll have a thicker, more muscular wall, and we'll see that when we get to the vasculature. Arteries carry blood always away from the heart, and veins always carry blood back to the heart. Now, uh, when you look at these diagrams, a lot of people get confused and they start thinking that the red ones are arteries and the blue ones are veins. That's almost always true, but there are some exceptions we'll point out when we get there. All right. And we pointed out the heart and blood vessels make up the cardiovascular system. So there are two circuits for the blood as it is sent through the body. There's the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. And if I can take just a step back here, the heart is a pump, but really I like to think of it as two pumps that are right next to each other. And we'll talk about how they work, but basically one of those pumps, the right side, will send blood out on the pulmonary circuit to the lungs. That blood is sent to the lungs where it drops off CO2, it picks up oxygen, and then that blood gets returned back to the left side of the heart. The left side of the heart, when it contracts, it sends blood out on the systemic circuit. And the systemic circuit carries blood to all the tissues of the body. And when we get to the tissues of the body, we're going to be dropping off oxygen. for the tissues to use, and then we're going to pick up CO2 that the tissues have produced. So the two circuits are kind of like exact opposites in that sense. On the pulmonary circuit, when we send blood to the lungs, we're dropping off CO2 that we picked up, and we're picking up oxygen for the tissues. On the systemic circuit, we're dropping off the oxygen we picked up, and we're picking up CO2 that was produced by the tissues. All right, so if we look at the heart here, okay, you can kind of see what I mean with the colors here. The right side here is blue, the left side here is red, okay? And that's because the right side of the heart, by the way, this is the patient's right and left, not my right and left, but the patient's right and left. So that's going to be reversed. That's one important thing to keep in mind when you look at these diagrams. So on the right side over here, the blood is deoxygenated. So we draw it as blue. Now in reality, the blood is not blue, it's just a dark red. Oxygenated blood is bright red. But to make things easier to see in these diagrams, we use red and blue to represent oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, respectively. So again, the right side of the heart is filled with blue deoxygenated blood, just blue in the diagram, not blue in reality. And this blood has come from the systemic circuit. This is blood that has been returned from the tissues to the heart. Now, the right side of the heart, when it contracts, it's going to send blood up the pulmonary trunk, off on the pulmonary arteries to the lungs. So when it contracts, it sends that deoxygenated blood up and over to the lungs. And in the lungs, in the capillaries of the lungs, we're going to drop off CO2 and we're going to pick up oxygen. And now that we've picked up oxygen, the blood is represented as this bright red color. It's oxygenated blood. And that gets returned over to the left side of the heart through the pulmonary veins. All right, now the pulmonary veins, they return that oxygenated, oxygen-rich blood to the left side of the heart. Now the left side of the heart, when it contracts, it's going to send blood up through this large artery. This is the largest artery. It's behind the pulmonary trunk here. And it's called the aorta. The aorta carries it up, and there are going to be several branches off of the aorta. And that's going to carry blood out on the systemic circuit to all of the tissues. Okay, so this collection of capillaries up here represents capillary beds in the head, face, arms, upper limbs. This capillary bed down here represents the blood flow to the organs, the abdomen, the legs, etc. Okay. And you can see again in the tissues, we bring in this red oxygenated blood. We drop off oxygen. We're going to pick up CO2. Now the blood is represented as this deoxygenated blue and carried back to the right side of the heart. Okay, so it's a circuit. It's a circuit. Left side of the heart sends oxygenated blood out to the tissues. It returns from the tissues to the other side of the heart, the right side, deoxygenated. That's the systemic circuit. The pulmonary circuit, we see deoxygenated blood. The heart contracts and sends that out to the lungs, where it gets oxygenated and then returned to the left side of the heart. So in both of these circuits, we're going to be sending blood out to either the tissues or the lungs, where it will get either oxygenated or deoxygenated, and then ultimately returned to the other side of the heart. And remember, guys, if you have questions, you can just throw them up there anytime. I'll look over to my right periodically. So the heart is a hollow, cone-shaped muscular pump. We say cone-shaped because it's kind of pointy down here. This pointy end is known as the apex. We'll talk about that in a second. Hollow in the sense that there's space inside the heart. Now that space is going to be filled with blood before contraction, and then we contract and push the blood out. But you could say it's hollow. It's located in a region called the mediastinum, which is in the thorax. The mediastinum is a space between the lungs, which also includes the thymus. Not thyroid, but thymus. All right. The heart, it sits right on top of the diaphragm, as do the lungs, but that's another unit. The heart contains four chambers. So there are two upper chambers called atria and two ventricles, which are the lower chambers. And the lower chambers, the ventricles, are the ones important for pumping, for contraction. So if you look up here, you can see this space in the upper portion of the heart. That is the right atrium. Okay, if we go over to the other side, this space in the upper portion of the heart, that is the left atrium. These are the upper chambers. There's a right and a left. And then we go down here and we've got these larger spaces, okay, called the ventricles. These lower chambers are the ventricles. There's a right and there's a left. And blood, as it returns from systemic circulation, enters the right atrium. All right. Now, the atrium, the word atrium, is Latin. And in these old Roman villas, they would have an atrium, which is a large entryway. You know, a lot of modern buildings have large entryways and called atria. And so the blood enters here and it waits for its chance to enter the left ventricle. If the left ventricle is contracting, then blood can't enter. Once the left ventricle relaxes, now blood can enter, and blood will pass from the, I can't remember if I've been saying right or left, but let's stay with right over here. Once the right ventricle relaxes, blood can pass from the right atrium into the right ventricle. Okay. Good. When the ventricle is contracting, no blood can enter because we have these valves here. Okay. And these are the atrial valves or atrioventricular valves. On the right side here, it has a specific name, the tricuspid valve, and on the left side, it's the bicuspid or mitral valve. And we'll talk more about heart anatomy in a little bit. We're just talking about function right now. So the blood that enters the ventricle from the atrium, about 70% of it passively enters. In other words, when this valve opens, when the ventricle is relaxing and this valve opens, about 70% of the blood in here just kind of falls in. 30% remains in the atrium, and then the atrium has to contract and push that remaining 30% into the ventricle. So atrial contraction, you can see, is important, but not necessarily essential for a properly functioning heart. And I bring this up because I want to talk about a friend of mine who has, he was in the hospital last week with atrial fibrillation. Atrial fibrillation is where the atria kind of shakes, it kind of shakes and flutters, and it's not contracting in sync, it's not contracting properly. And so what that means is at least 70% of the blood that should enter his ventricles was still entering the ventricles. You know, 30% or less was remaining in the atria with each contraction of the heart, each heartbeat. And what that means ultimately is that the heart was less efficient at pumping as a unit, but that still the majority of the blood was getting pumped. And so it's not immediately fatal. Atrial fibrillation is usually not immediately fatal, but it can lead to complications. So for one, you can have blood clots start to form in the heart, and that can lead to a heart attack, pulmonary embolism. We talked about all that in the blood unit. If blood pools in the heart, it can form a blood clot. That can lead to also stroke, I didn't mention, can lead to stroke. it'll lead to a sort of hypoxic state as you're not pumping enough oxygen. If you're only, your brain's only getting 70% of the oxygen that it needs if you're pumping 70% of the blood that you need to be pumping. So um, it leads to atrial fibrillation, leads to a less efficient heart that is not immediately fatal, but can lead to complications and needs to be treated. All right. And that happened to my friend. I mentioned him. He had the atrial fibrillation, and that led to, um, we're not sure, possibly a mini stroke. Recently, he is slurring speech, slow to answer questions, all signs of a stroke. He also lost consciousness, and upon regaining consciousness, was confused again because the brain was hypoxic or low on oxygen. All right, so moving on, we talked about the ventricles. And the heart we talked about before is sitting here on top of the diaphragm. The diaphragm, you'll remember, is a muscular wall that separates the thorax from the abdomen. Okay? The diaphragm will be very important when we get to the respiratory unit, but for now, we just need to know the heart sits on top of it. Now, if you look at a triangle or a pyramid, the pointy bit on the top is known as the apex. And here on the heart, we have an apex down here. And so the heart is kind of oriented like an upside down pyramid with the point down here at the bottom, upside down and sideways. All right, so what else we have? The base of the heart, of course, if this is an upside down pyramid, the base of the heart's going to be up here at the top. Okay, and that's where we see the large blood vessels entering and exiting the heart. All right, sorry about that. All right, sorry, having problems here. So surrounding the heart is a layer called the pericardium. Peri means around, and so there's the layer surrounding the heart. And it covers both the heart and the other large blood vessels up here. The parietal pericardium, because this is a serous membrane, the parietal layer is going to be lining the body cavity. In other words, lining the mediastinum or the wall of the chest as well. And then the visceral layer is going to be in direct contact with the heart. It's attached to the surface of the heart. And it's actually also called the epicardium. The epicardium is the outermost layer of the heart itself. So, might be a little hard to remember. The inner layer of this serous membrane is also the outer layer of the heart. So, in the heart, we have three layers. The epicardium, the outermost layer, which is also the visceral layer of the serous membrane, the visceral pericardium. You have the myocardium, which is this thick muscular layer, makes up most of the wall of the heart. And then you have this inner lining called the endocardium. And the inner lining is smooth to prevent the formation of blood clots and the accumulation of platelets. All right, sorry about that again. So the endocardium again is smooth, and this prevents, well, attempts to prevent the formation of blood clots and keep things from sticking to the walls of the heart. All right, good. So we mentioned the right atrium, ventricle, left atrium, ventricle, the four chambers of the heart. Um, the atria in general are thin-walled, and then the ventricles are going to be thick-walled. The ventricles are going to be far more muscular than the atria. We should also mention the auricles. Now, the auricles are part of the atria. Ugh, uh-oh, I'll deal with that later. Um, So anyway, the atria are thin-walled, and sort of a part of them or attached to them are the auricles, which are these flap-like projections, and they allow the atria to expand. So if we go back and we look here, we know from the cross section that the right atrium is roughly in this region. You see this purple flap on the outside of the atrium? Okay, it looks kind of like an elephant's ear, and when blood pressure is high and there's a lot of blood returning to the heart, more than usual, blood is able to back out of the atrium and into the auricle and fill this space. So it allows the atrium, in a sense, to expand. It's kind of like reserve capacity for the atrium. Now, the word auricle here, A-U-R-I-C-L-E, is actually Greek for ear. And so you can maybe remember that. It looks like a folded over dog's ear or elephant ear. So the valves in the heart, we have the atrioventricular valves. Those are the tricuspid and the bicuspid or mitral valves. Uh, and then we have the semilunar valves, which are the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve. Okay. Um, so well, let's look at a picture. Let's just talk about it this way. A lot of people get confused about this. So the atrioventricular valves, there are two of them. Okay. And each one has a special name. This one over here on the right side, that's the tricuspid. This one over here on the left side is the bicuspid. Now, why tricuspid versus bicuspid? The one on the right has three cusps in the valve. The one on the left has two cusps, hence the name bicuspid. Now, many people prefer the name mitral valve, and mitral refers to a mitre, which is a um, like a bishop's hat. Mitre, yeah. Oops, we had a picture right here. All right, looks like this. Okay, uh, it looks like that the mitral valve does, and so it gets the name mitral valve. All right, but it's also the bicuspid. That's fine too. And the atrioventricular valves control the flow of blood from the atria into the ventricles. Really, their main job is to prevent the backflow of blood from the ventricles into the atria. So you can see the ventricles down here. They're very muscular, and when they're going to contract, they're going to generate a lot of force. And when they generate this force, there is some pressure to move blood backward, but we don't want to do that. That would make the heart less efficient. So this valve prevents the backflow of blood and forces blood not backwards, but forces it to move forward up the pulmonary trunk from the right side of the heart and then out to the pulmonary arteries. Okay, so when pressure builds up in here, blood can't flow back because the tricuspid valve is preventing that, and so it has to move forward up the pulmonary valve, up the pulmonary trunk. Now, if you had stenosis in your tricuspid valve, um, then it's possible that you could have incomplete closure and then you could have blood flow back, and that's going to make the heart less efficient. Same thing's true over here on the left side. Blood flows from the left atrium into the ventricle. And when the ventricle is going to contract, it's going to generate a lot of force. And that blood, we need it to not flow back. So the bicuspid or mitral valve prevents backflow and forces the blood to move forward up the atrium. Now, leading to the atrium, you can see this valve here. This is the aortic valve. All right, it's one of the semilunar valves. The other semilunar valve is not pictured over here, it's pictured over here. You have the pulmonary valve. These semilunar valves also prevent backflow. All right, and so what happens in the ventricle is that it contracts and it generates a lot of force. The force has to overcome the aortic semilunar valve, okay, so that blood can pass into the aorta. There's already pressure in the aorta because there's already blood in the aorta. And so we have to generate greater pressure in the ventricle than we see in the aorta to push that blood into the aorta. And so we see that blood move into the aorta. All right. And now pressure builds in the aorta. All right. As blood kind of backs up this way, we got to push all the blood in the systemic circuit forward to move blood in here. Um, we're going to prevent the backflow of blood into the left ventricle with the the aortic valve here. Same thing happens over on the right side, by the way. We mentioned blood passes by the tricuspid. The right side contracts and then it pushes blood forward. It has to push it past the pulmonary valve. And once blood gets past the pulmonary valve will prevent the backflow back into the right side of the heart. All right, so here we have a cross section of the base of the heart. So at the top left, you can see the top of the tricuspid valve. We've basically cut away the atria here, and you can see the tricuspid valve. At the top right, you've got the mitral valve. Okay, these are the atrioventricular valves. Now over here, you can see the semilunar valves. Okay, you've got the aortic semilunar valve here. And then anteriorly, you've got the pulmonary valve, all right, leading to the pulmonary trunk right here. So the heart has a fibrous skeleton, you could say. There are rings of dense connective tissue here which surround the valves. Okay. They provide attachment sites for the valves and for muscle fibers. They also prevent excess dilation of the heart chambers during contraction. Um, and so these rings, along with other fibrous masses, make up the skeleton of the heart. Let's look at something really cool now called a ghost heart. You guys ever hear of a ghost heart? All right. This is a decellularized heart. I sometimes talk to my A&P1 students about ghost hearts. They're really cool. And so what they are decellularized hearts. You can take the heart and through a process remove all of the cells in the heart, and what you're left with here is the connective tissue which makes up the heart, the protein scaffolding that makes up the heart. Without the cells, the extracellular matrix, without the cells, it's all here. And why is this technology exciting? Because you can seed it now with stem cells, and now if you used your own adult stem cells and seeded this heart, it would become a heart made up of your cells, and so you would not reject it in a transplant. Here's where the technology actually is. For human and pig hearts, here's where we are. We can remove the cells. as far as reseeding them goes, here's where we are. This is a rat heart. And you can see they decellularize the heart. They remove all of the cells. They reseed the rat heart with is adult stem cells. And they get, in the end, a heart that is full of cells and can contract, and it looks really cool. But as we'll see, the way the heart contracts, the order in which parts contract, is really important, and they're having a hard time now getting the heart to synchronize, getting the different parts of the heart to synchronize. All right, so blood flow, we kind of covered this a little bit earlier, but basically, blood returns from the systemic circuit to the right side of the heart via the vena cava. Okay, these are the large veins. There's a superior and an inferior vena cava. And blood also returns to the right side through the coronary sinus, which you really can't see in this diagram. If I go to another one. All right, so here on the outside of the heart, you can see it's surrounded by small blood vessels. Those small blood vessels actually feed the heart muscle itself. All right, blood that flows through the heart does not feed or nourish or supply the heart muscle in any way. Only blood flowing through these small vessels on the outside of the heart will supply the heart with nutrients and oxygen and etc. And anyway, blood returns from these small vessels through the coronary sinus, and the coronary sinus empties into the right atrium, and we'll see that when we get to the vasculature. Anyway, so blood returns from the systemic circuit through the inferior vena cava, the superior vena cava, and the coronary sinus, bringing back blood directly from the heart. And it enters the right atrium, passes into the right ventricle. 70% of that blood just basically falls in. The remaining 30% has to be pushed in a process called the atrial kick, which just basically the atria contracts and kicks out the last 30%. Now, the right side begins to contract. Pressure builds in the right ventricle. That's going to close this valve and prevent the backflow of blood. Pressure continues to build until we overcome the pulmonary valve, and we're going to send blood out once we overcome it on the pulmonary circuit. Now, this deoxygenated blood, which has been coming back from the tissues to the right side of the heart, gets carried to the lungs on the pulmonary arteries, and that blood gets oxygenated. It picks up oxygen and dumps off CO2. We then bring that oxygenated blood back through the pulmonary veins to the left side of the heart. And now something very similar happens where 30% of the blood is, 70% is going to fall into the ventricles, 30% is pushed in through atrial contraction. Then the ventricles begin to contract. When they do, pressure builds inside the ventricle. And when pressure builds, that's going to close this valve early on. We continue to build pressure until we can send blood up the aorta, past the aortic semilunar valve here. All right, out on the pulmonary circuit. Blood is carried out on the pulmonary circuit. Wait, did I say pulmonary? I said that like 2 or 3 times. We're sending blood out now on the systemic circuit to the tissues. Okay, and so we carry this oxygenated blood out to the tissues, and we're going to dump off oxygen, all right, and pick up CO2, ultimately returning blood back to the right atrium. Okay. All right, so the left and right coronary arteries you can see here are the first branches off of the aorta. Here's the aortic valve. Blood exits the left ventricle, it enters the aorta, and then blood passes out through these coronary arteries, and they are going to, as we said, feed the actual heart muscle itself. All right, so here are the branches of the coronary arteries. Off of the aorta, we have the right and left coronary arteries. The right coronary artery is going to include the posterior interventricular artery and the marginal artery. The left coronary artery includes the circumflex artery and the anterior interventricular artery. Okay. Um, so they're going to carry blood again to the actual heart wall, to the muscle of the heart itself. And they're going to dump off oxygen there as well as other nutrients. And they're going to pick up carbon dioxide. And they're going to return that deoxygenated blood through the cardiac veins to the cardiac sinus, which empties into the right atrium. All right, and so over here, you can see branching off of the left artery. Okay, you've got the anterior interventricular artery over here. Branching off of the right, you've got the marginal artery. Okay, here's the right coronary artery. We got the marginal artery there. On the back side, you can see the circumflex artery. All right, passing back here. You've also got the posterior interventricular artery, interventricular artery. Interventricular means between the ventricles, and so that's kind of a key on where you'll find it. We got the left and right ventricles here because we're looking at the backside of the heart. So posterior interventricular artery will be found between the ventricles on the backside. Anterior interventricular artery will be found between the ventricles on the front. So the cardiac cycle are the events of a heartbeat. The heart chambers have to function in a coordinated manner, as we said. The heart actions have to be regulated so that the atria contract while the ventricles relax, and then the ventricles contract while the atria relax. All right, and so we talked about this before, but basically when the ventricles are contracting, blood cannot enter the ventricles. So the atria will spend this time relaxing and filling with blood. Once the ventricles relax, pressure in here drops, and then blood can pass from the atria into the ventricles. That's called ventricular filling. The ventricles then fill with blood, and we see contraction of the ventricles again. That blood is passed on to the pulmonary trunk or the aorta, depending on which ventricle we're talking about. But basically, one contracts while the other relaxes. That's the important thing to remember. The atrium will contract when the ventricles are relaxed. The ventricles will contract when the atria is relaxed. Now, contraction is known as systole, and relaxation of the chamber is known as diastole. Now, when we talk about these systole and diastole, you may have heard those terms come up with blood pressure. And there we're talking about contraction of the ventricles, especially the left ventricle. And so your systolic blood pressure is the blood pressure when the left ventricle is contracting, and the diastolic blood pressure is your blood pressure when the ventricle is relaxing. All right, and so here we have some treatments for people who have had myocardial infarction. Myocardial infarction is again the death of heart tissue due to the blockage of one of those coronary arteries. Okay, and so if you've had heart tissue die, it's not coming back, and so it's not gonna regrow. Actually, while we're on the topic, one area of research is the zebrafish. It turns out the zebrafish heart, if you kill like 40% of its heart, it actually can fully regrow its heart, and it functions. And so they are actually looking at how the zebrafish does this, and maybe seeing if there's a way to get human hearts to regrow. But for now, these are the technologies we have. Um, all right. For now, these are the technologies we have. You can get a heart transplant. Now, that's not ideal. I mean, obviously, you want to live, and so if that's your only option, you'll go with it. But you have to take immunosuppressive drugs for the rest of your life. And these immunosuppressive drugs make you more susceptible to fungal infections, rare fungal infections, things that the modern world has just kind of forgotten about. We don't get these diseases anymore. Um, but you're now suddenly susceptible to them if you're taking immunosuppressants for the rest of your life. Also, heart transplants are not permanent. It's not a forever heart. Eventually, your immune system will attack and degrade the heart to the point where it has to be replaced. Often within 7 to 10 years, you've got to get a new heart. Moving on, we've got left ventricular assist devices. Now, this is a mechanical half heart that's used in some cases temporarily until a donor heart becomes available. And the old ones sat outside the body, new ones can sit inside. We also have an implantable replacement heart made of titanium and plastic, and it's used in people that cannot have a heart transplant and don't have long to live. We then have stem cell technologies where we can create stem cell patches that try to regrow heart tissue. Ultimately, that would be, a good goal to regrow heart tissue, but for now, it's the technology's not there yet. Now, here is a picture I took. That is my hand in the picture, so that should give you some sense of scale. It is a more or less normal sized adult male's hand there. And the heart, your heart, should be roughly the size of a fist. Okay, should be roughly the size of a fist. And on the left there, we have some, uh, these are left ventricular assist devices, actually, all of them. And they're kind of going here from oldest to newest, from left to right. And you can see that first one on the left is enormous. That would sit outside your chest. And you can see there are two tubes there. One receives blood. Um, one receives blood from the ventricle, and the other returns blood to the ventricle so that we can generate more pressure in the ventricle to send blood through the heart. Okay. Here we can see an early artificial heart. It actually came in two pieces. Those white patches in the middle are Velcro, which actually holds them together. All right, now the each of those round portions, those are a sort of an artificial ventricle there. The tubes on each side, they receive blood, and then they'll be passed on to the aorta and the pulmonary valves. Sorry. All right. So let's go ahead and stop it there for today. This is enough information. I know there's a lot already. We're going to try and take this slow, as I said. Do you guys have any questions so far? Okay. All right. So, if you do have any questions, feel free to email me anytime. I'm happy to uh, answer any questions you have or um, clear things up for you. Great. So we will see you guys Tuesday online. We'll have another lecture online, and I'll put up the lab materials a little bit later today. All right. Thank you for tuning in, guys.